Welcome, brave souls, to tonight's tale of terror. A story whispered in shadows about a house at the edge of the woods where silence is never empty, and doors should never be opened. Stay with us, if you dare. The forest stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of trees whose branches clawed at the gray sky. The path beneath Samir's boots was little more than a ribbon of dirt and scattered leaves, winding deeper and deeper into the heart of the woods. He adjusted the strap of his worn leather bag on his shoulder and tried to ignore the unsettling silence that clung to the air. No bird song, no rustling of animals. Just the faint crunch of his own footsteps and the occasional groan of the wind twisting through the trees. He had been walking for nearly an hour since the bus had dropped him at the roadside. Behind him lay the fading hum of the world he knew, bustling streets, crowded apartments, and the safe banality of everyday life. Ahead of him loomed a destination he had both dreaded and anticipated: his late Uncle S. house. The inheritance had been unexpected. A lawyer's letter, yellowed with time, had arrived in his mailbox 3 weeks ago. It spoke of his uncle Yusuf, a man Samir barely remembered from his childhood, who had passed away under unusual circumstances. The letter was brief, almost rushed, as if the lawyer himself had wanted nothing to do with the matter, yet it carried weight. Samir was now the sole heir to the property, an old house deep within the forest, a place whispered about even in the city for its unsettling reputation. Samir hadn't wanted to come, but debt, loneliness, and curiosity had driven him here. Maybe he could sell the place, he reasoned, start fresh somewhere else. Or maybe he would uncover answers to the questions no one had ever dared to ask. The trees parted suddenly, and there it was. The house rose from the earth like a forgotten monument, its stone walls mottled with moss, its roof sagging beneath decades of neglect. Windows gaped open, dark and hollow, some shattered, others boarded shut. The front door leaned slightly, its paint stripped away to reveal gray, splintering wood. For a long moment, Samir just stood at the edge of the clearing, staring. The place felt alive, in a way he couldn't explain. It wasn't just a building, it was a presence, watching him, waiting. His stomach tightened. He could still turn back. The road was long, but not impossible. He could return to the bus stop, to the safety of noise and people. But another voice inside him whispered, "You've come this far. There's no going back now." He took a deep breath and approached. Each step across the weed-choked path felt heavier, as if unseen hands clutched at his ankles. When he reached the door, he paused again. His reflection wavered faintly in the cracked glass of the nearest window. Pale and uncertain, he reached out, pushed the door open, and was greeted by the long, aching groan of rusted hinges. The smell hit him first: damp wood, mildew, dust. The air was heavy, stagnant, as though it hadn't been disturbed in years. He stepped into a wide hallway, its wooden floorboards sagging beneath his weight. A staircase curled upward to the second floor, its banister chipped and scarred. Doors lined both sides of the hall, leading to shadowed rooms. Cobwebs hung in the corners like tattered curtains. But what unsettled him most were the paintings. They covered nearly every wall. Portraits of men, women, and children. Yet none of the faces were clear. They were smudged, distorted, as if the artist had blurred them intentionally. The eyes, however, were sharp, too sharp. They seemed to follow him as he moved, watching, judging. A shiver crawled down his spine. He forced himself to keep walking, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud. Samir tried to recall his uncle, but the memories were faint. A stern man with a voice like gravel, hands always ink-stained from writing. He remembered visiting once, as a boy, though the details were hazy. His mother had pulled him away quickly, whispering about strange habits and things a child shouldn't see. Now, standing in the decayed hallway, those words echoed in his head. He pushed open a door to his right. The room beyond was a study, lined with sagging shelves. Books lay scattered across the floor, their pages curled and yellowed. A desk sat near the window, its surface covered in dust and old stains. On the desk lay a journal, its leather cover cracked with age. Samir hesitated, then picked it up. The pages were filled with tight, frantic handwriting. Most of it was illegible, but one line stood out, written in bold strokes. The house is hungry. The house remembers. His throat tightened. He snapped the book shut and shoved it back onto the desk. By the time the sun sank below the trees, the house had grown darker than the forest itself. Shadows stretched long across the walls, pooling in the corners like black water. Samir managed to light a fire in the hearth of the main room, its flames crackling weakly against the chill. He sat on a dusty armchair, staring into the flames, trying to ignore the oppressive silence. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, coming from upstairs. He froze, every muscle in his body tense. He told himself it was the house settling, wood creaking after years of disrepair, but the sound was too measured, too human. Gripping his flashlight, he rose and crept toward the staircase. Each step groaned beneath him, the sound echoing in the empty hall. At the top, the corridor stretched long and narrow, lined with closed doors. One door stood slightly ajar, lightless and waiting. He pushed it open. The room was empty. Dust floated in the beam of his flashlight. The only thing on the wall, scrawled in faded black ink, were words that made his blood run cold. "You are not alone." Samir stepped back from the wall, his breath fogging in the cold air. The words "You are not alone" were scrawled unevenly, as though written in haste, yet the ink seemed old, almost faded into the plaster. His skin prickled as though invisible eyes pressed against his back. He spun, shining the flashlight across the room. Dust, cobwebs, rotting furniture slumped against the corners. Nothing moved. Yet the feeling lingered. He was being watched. He forced himself to breathe slowly, muttering under his breath, "It's just a trick. Old graffiti. Nothing more." But the words didn't feel like graffiti. They felt like a warning. The corridor of doors. Back in the hallway, Samir noticed something strange. The paintings had changed, subtle, almost imperceptible shifts. A mouth that had been closed was now curved into a faint smirk. Eyes that had stared straight ahead now turned slightly, following him more deliberately. He tried to convince himself it was the flicker of the flashlight, the tricks of his tired mind. Yet when he blinked, the changes remained. One painting in particular caught his attention. A tall man in a dark coat, his face blurred beyond recognition. Only the eyes were clear cold, gray, piercing. As Samir stared, he swore he saw the man's chest rise and fall, as if breathing. He tore his gaze away and hurried down the stairs, his heart pounding. The whisper. That night, Samir lay on the couch in the main room, wrapped in his jacket. The fire in the hearth sputtered weakly, throwing restless shadows along the walls. Every creak of the house gnawed at his nerves. He was on the edge of sleep when it came. A whisper. At first, faint like wind through the cracks of the windows, but then clearer, more insistent. A voice. A woman's voice. Samir. His eyes snapped open. He sat upright, scanning the room. Nothing. Only the firelight. Then the voice again, this time closer, at his ear. Samir. He leapt to his feet, flashlight trembling in his grip. "Who's there?" he shouted into the emptiness. Silence answered, but on the floor, near the hearth, lay a piece of paper that hadn't been there before. The second warning, the paper was yellowed, its edges curled. Scrawled across it in jagged handwriting were the words, "Leave before it's too late." Samir's throat went dry. His hands shook as he held the note. He spun around, searching every shadow, every corner. But the house was still empty. Or at least, it appeared to be. He stuffed the note into his pocket, determined not to lose it. Proof, he thought. If nothing else, it was proof that someone was here. Yet the more he thought about it, the less sense it made. The bus driver hadn't wanted to stop at the forest road. The villagers at the diner had stared at him with pity when he mentioned his uncle's name. If anyone else had been here, they would have warned him directly. So, who left the note? Or worse, what? The basement? The next day, Samir forced himself to explore further. The house loomed around him, oppressive, as though each wall leaned inward to keep him trapped. In the kitchen, rusted pans hung from broken hooks. The smell of mold rose from the sink. A back door led him to a narrow stairwell descending into darkness. The basement. Every instinct told him not to go down, but something compelled him forward, step by creaking step. The air grew colder with each descent. The smell of damp stone and rot filled his nose. At the bottom, his flashlight revealed shelves lined with glass jars, each filled with cloudy liquid and shapes that twisted within. He stepped closer, stomach churning. Some jars held insects, others contained small bones. One jar, larger than the rest, contained something that looked disturbingly like a human hand. Samir stumbled back, gagging. His beam of light fell across an old chest shoved against the far wall. Its lock was rusted, but after several hard pulls, it snapped open. Inside were journals, dozens of them, bound in leather, pages brittle with age. He opened one at random. The handwriting was frantic, desperate. The voices don't stop. They crawl through the walls at night, begging, promising, threatening. I tried to resist, but the house demands another page. The door upstairs must never be opened. It is the mouth. The mouth must stay closed. Samir slammed the book shut, his pulse racing. The door upstairs. He had seen it, the one locked with iron. The locked door. That evening, unable to resist, Samir crept back upstairs. The hallway seemed longer now, stretching impossibly into the dark. Each painting's eyes gleamed faintly as though alive. At the very end stood the locked door. Its iron lock glistened in the beam of his flashlight. He pressed his ear against the wood. At first, nothing, just silence. Then a sound, a whisper, faint, muffled, but unmistakable. A voice. "Let me out." Samir stumbled back, the journal's warning echoing in his head. The mouth must stay closed. The hallucination. That night, his dreams were worse. He saw the house not as wood and stone, but as flesh. The walls throbbed with veins. The windows blinked like eyes. The doors yawned like mouths. And in the center of it all, bound by chains, sat a figure, pale, waiting. He awoke, drenched in sweat, heart hammering. The whisper lingered in his ears even as he sat upright in the cold dark. "Samir, you are mine now." Samir could barely steady his breathing. The dream had shaken him so badly that even the flicker of the fire felt threatening. He rubbed his temples, trying to ground himself. But the words from the journal, the whispers from the locked room, and the visions in his sleep all tangled together in his mind until he couldn't tell which was real. He decided he needed answers, searching for clues. The next morning, pale light spilled weakly through the cracked windows. Samir carried one of the journals into the dining room and set it on the dust-caked table. Its pages smelled of mold and iron, and each sentence seemed to claw at his sanity. One entry described a hunger beneath the floorboards that grew louder when the moon was full. Another detailed rituals performed in candlelight. The house's previous occupants offering drops of blood to the walls to keep the whispers quiet. His hands shook as he turned the pages. Who had written these? His uncle Yusef. Someone before him? On the final page, smeared with what looked like dried blood, were words etched so deeply the paper tore. The house is not haunted. The house is alive. Samir shoved the journal away, bile rising in his throat. The window. Seeking air, he went to the second-floor hallway and opened a window. Cold wind rushed in, carrying the damp scent of the forest. For a moment, he felt relief. Then he looked down. In the clearing below, standing motionless among the weeds, was a figure, a man. Tall, thin, wearing a dark coat. Samir's breath caught. The face was blurred by distance, but he recognized it instantly from the painting at the end of the hall. The figure raised a hand, slow and deliberate. Not waving, pointing. pointing at the house. Samir stumbled back, slamming the window shut. When he looked again, the clearing was empty. The first attack? That night, Samir tried to sleep in the living room, the journals locked back in the chest, but the whisperers returned, circling him like predators. They rose and fell, dozens of voices overlapping until they became a chorus of torment. He clamped his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. Then came the scratching, long, deep claws dragging across the walls. Upstairs, downstairs, beneath the floor, the house trembled with it. Suddenly, the fire in the hearth sputtered and went out. Darkness swallowed him whole, and in that darkness, two pale eyes opened across the room. Samir scrambled for his flashlight, his fingers trembling as he clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark hands, the eyes were gone. Nothing but shadows and the faint outline of the old armchair. But he could feel it, the weight of a presence pressing against him, suffocating. The marker. At dawn, exhausted and trembling, Samir stumbled to the bathroom to splash water on his face. As he lifted his head, he froze. In the mirror, across his neck, was a mark, a handprint, faint, dark, as though pressed into his flesh by something unseen. He staggered back, clutching at his throat, but the skin was cold, numb. The whispers in the house seemed to purr with satisfaction. The resolve. Samir realized then that he couldn't ignore it any longer. The house wasn't just cursed it. Wanted him. It had chosen him. He remembered the words from the journal. The mouth must stay closed. Whatever was behind the locked door was connected to everything the whispers, the paintings, the figure in the clearing. He didn't know if opening it would save him or doom him, but he knew one thing for certain. Sooner or later, the house would force him to decide. And as the sun set on his first full day inside the cursed walls, Samir sat by the cold fireplace, clutching the rusted iron key he had found in the desk drawer. He stared at it for hours, his mind circling one terrible truth. He was not alone, and the house was waiting. End of Chapter 1. The fire refused to light that night. The whispers grew bolder, calling his name again and again. Upstairs, the locked door thudded once, twice, as if something inside had begun to stir. Samir closed his eyes, whispering to himself, "Tomorrow, tomorrow, I'll face it." And in the silence that followed, a laugh echoed through the halls, low and cruel, as though the house itself had heard his vow. The house woke with him. Samir opened his eyes to the dim gray of morning, though it felt less like dawn and more like the fading of night. The air was colder than before, heavy with a dampness that clung to his lungs. For a moment, he lay still on the couch, hoping foolishly that the night had been only a dream, that the footsteps, the voices, the eyes in the dark were all tricks of exhaustion. Then he heard it, a faint scratching sound. It came from inside the walls. He sat up slowly, every muscle in his body tensed. The sound traveled like something crawling just beyond reach, moving from one side of the room to the other. It paused, then began again up the wall, across the ceiling, down toward the floorboards beneath his feet. Samir forced himself to speak. "Rats!" he muttered. Though the word rang hollow, rats didn't whisper his name in the night. Rats didn't leave notes on tables or carve warnings into plaster. The dining room. Determined not to show fear, Samir grabbed the flashlight and followed the sound into the dining room. The long wooden table sat in the center, its surface veiled in dust, chairs leaning drunkenly against it. Light from the cracked windows filtered in weakly, illuminating cobwebs that hung like curtains. The scratching stopped. He held his breath, waiting, and then, slowly, one of the chairs at the far end scraped backward across the floor. Samir froze, his throat tightening. The chair moved with purpose, sliding neatly away from the table as though inviting someone or something to sit. He shone the flashlight directly at it. Nothing. No movement. No wind. No logical explanation. Yet the chair remained pulled out, patient, waiting. His heart hammered. He backed away, step by step, until the room was swallowed once more by shadow. The second note. When he returned to the living room, something new was waiting on the mantel above the fireplace. Another note. This one wasn't yellowed like the first. The paper was fresh, crisp, as if written moments ago. A single sentence sprawled across it in jagged letters. Do not open the locked room upstairs. Samir's hands trembled as he held it. Someone or something was watching him constantly, close enough to leave messages without being seen. He thought of the door at the end of the hallway. He thought of the whisper that had slipped through the crack. Let me out. Why warn him? Why not simply force him? The question gnawed at his mind. The voice behind the door. By late afternoon, Samir found himself standing once again in the upstairs hallway. The paintings leered at him with their shifting expressions, their blurred faces sharpening as if eager for his next move. The locked door loomed at the end, its iron lock gleaming dully in the fading light. He approached slowly, each step echoing too loudly. He pressed his ear against the wood. At first, silence, then faint and broken, like a voice carried on a storm. Samir. He jerked back, heart racing. The voice came again, smoother this time, low and coaxing. Samir. Open the door. His fingers brushed the key in his pocket, the iron heavy against his palm. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to turn away. The warning note burned in his mind. Do not open the locked room upstairs. But as he descended the stairs, he couldn't shake the thought that perhaps the voice wasn't a threat at all. Perhaps it was a plea. The dream. That night, he dreamed again. He stood in the hallway, the locked door before him. Knocking came from the other side, steady, desperate. His hand lifted the key, sliding it into the lock. Behind him, whispers rose like a tide, dozens of voices overlapping. Some begged him to open it. Others screamed for him to run. As the door creaked open, he saw only darkness beyond. Then, a pair of hands shot out cold, skeletal fingers clutching his throat. He woke gasping, clawing at his neck, convinced for a moment the dream had followed him into waking life. And in the silence of the house, he swore he heard the faintest laugh echoing from upstairs. Morning came, though it brought no comfort. The forest outside the windows was drowned in fog, the trees little more than pale silhouettes. Samir brewed instant coffee on a rusty camping stove he'd found in the kitchen, the bitter liquid doing little to steady his nerves. He carried the mug into the library, hoping distraction would calm his mind. The shelves sagged under the weight of forgotten books, many of them swollen with moisture, their spines cracked. He brushed away dust and pulled one free. Its pages crumbled at his touch. Behind the shelf, his fingers grazed something unusual. A hollow space in the wall. Heart pounding, he shoved the heavy books aside. Inside was a wooden box, small, blackened with age, tied shut with frayed twine. Samir hesitated, then pulled it out and set it on the table. He untied the twine with shaking hands. The lid creaked open, releasing a stale odor that stung his nose. Inside lay a shriveled hand, the hand in the box. The skin was leathery, the fingers curled as if frozen mid-scream. Carved deep into the palm was a symbol, a circle split with jagged lines, radiating outward like cracks in glass. Samir gagged, dropping the box, its contents spilling across the table. The symbol seemed to pulse faintly, glowing in the dim light. And then the whispers began. Not faint this time. Not muffled. Loud. Overlapping voices crowding the air, rising and falling in a maddening rhythm. They spoke no language he knew, yet the meaning pressed into his mind. Hunger, rage, demand. Samir clamped his hands over his ears, but it didn't stop. The voices were inside him, worming their way through his thoughts. "Stop!" he shouted. "Stop it!" The whispers cut off. Silence crashed down, heavier than sound. And on the wall across from him, carved freshly into the plaster, were words that hadn't been there before. "You can't leave the forest that traps." Shaken, Samir decided to test it. He couldn't stay here. Whatever secrets the house held weren't worth his sanity. He packed his bag quickly, slung it over his shoulder, and strode out the front door into the foggy clearing. The forest path stretched ahead. He walked fast, his boots crunching over wet leaves, his breath steaming in the cold. For nearly an hour, he pushed forward, refusing to look back. The trees thickened, the fog deepened, but he pressed on. Finally, the trees parted. Relief surged through him. He was free. Then he froze. Before him stood the house. He had returned to the same clearing. His chest tightened. He spun around, scanning the forest. The path was gone, swallowed by fog. Only the house remained, looming, waiting. Samir staggered back, shaking his head. No, I walked straight. I didn't turn. The front door creaked open on its own, as if inviting him back inside. The shadows grow bolder. That night, he didn't bother with the fireplace. He sat in the corner of the living room, knife in hand, every muscle taut. The house groaned and sighed around him, but he refused to sleep. The paintings seemed brighter now, the blurred faces sharpening as though revealing themselves piece by piece. One portrayed a woman with hollow eyes, had a mouth that moved when the wind howled, lips forming words he couldn't hear. At midnight, the scratching returned, louder this time, claws tearing at the walls, ceiling, floor. The entire house vibrated with it. Then the locked door upstairs slammed once, twice, as if something inside had hurled itself against it. Samir gripped the knife tighter, sweat dripping down his face. "Stay closed," he whispered, voice trembling. "Stay closed." The door rattled again, harder, and the laugh returned, low, cruel, echoing through the beams. Samir's grip on the knife tightened until his knuckles whitened. The laugh faded, but the silence that followed was worse. He sat motionless, every nerve stretched thin, listening for the next sound. The fireless hearth gaped like an open mouth. The paintings along the wall seemed to lean closer, their eyes fixed, unblinking. The house itself was waiting. Finally, exhaustion betrayed him. His eyelids drooped despite his fear. Sleep pulled him under like a tide. The dream of chains. He dreamed he was back in the upstairs hallway, standing before the locked door. The key glinted in his hands, cold and heavy. From behind the door came a low hum, like dozens of voices chanting in unison. Chains rattled, the wood strained, bulging outward as though something massive pressed against it. "Samir," the voice whispered, layered and endless. "Let me out." He tried to run, but the floor beneath him stretched like tar, pulling him closer to the door. His hands shook, the key sliding toward the lock on its own. When the door finally burst open, darkness flooded out, swallowing him whole. He woke, screaming. The mark spreads. Sweat drenched his clothes, his throat raw. Gasping, he stumbled to the bathroom, desperate for water. When he lifted his head to the mirror, his blood froze. The faint handprint on his neck was darker now, clearer. Black veins spread outward from it like cracks in glass, creeping across his skin. He clawed at them, but they didn't fade. The whispers purred, satisfied, vibrating through the walls. "You are ours." Samir slammed his fists against the sink. "No, I won't let you take me." His voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the house. The figure returns. Later, desperate for proof of his sanity, Samir went to the upstairs window again. The fog still pressed against the glass, thick as smoke. And there he was, the man in the dark coat, standing perfectly still in the clearing, head tilted up toward the window. This time, his face was not blurred. Samir saw hollow sockets where eyes should have been. A grin stretched too wide, splitting the skin. The figure raised its arm again, pointing not at the house, but directly at Samir. Samir stumbled back, heart hammering. He blinked once and the figure was gone. But when he looked down at the floor, muddy footprints trailed across the hallway, leading from the window to the locked door. The night of the storm. That evening, thunder cracked overhead. Rain lashed against the roof, seeping through the broken tiles. The house groaned under the storm, every beam shuddering. Samir sat by the cold hearth, journals scattered around him, reading feverishly. Lightning illuminated the pages, each flash revealing words he hadn't seen before, words that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves as he read. The house chooses, the house binds, the house feeds. Another line, the only way out is through the mouth. Samir dropped the journal, his pulse racing. Through the mouth, through the locked door. He realized then that the house wasn't just keeping him prisoner, it was pushing him, forcing him closer to the one place it had warned him not to go. And as the storm raged outside, the door upstairs rattled with each clap of thunder, harder, louder, until it sounded as though the entire second floor would collapse. End of Chapter 2. Samir clutched the iron key, his hands slick with sweat. He knew the truth now. He could try to resist, to hide, to run in circles through the endless forest, but the house would never let him go. The only way forward, the only way to end this, was to open the door. As the storm howled and the laughter of unseen voices filled the walls, Samir whispered into the dark, "Tomorrow night, I'll face it." The house seemed to sigh with satisfaction. The storm had passed, but the house still groaned as though recovering from the violence of the night. Samir awoke on the couch, his body aching, his throat raw from shouting in his sleep. He didn't remember the dream clearly, only flashes of chains, a mouth that opened too wide, and voices chanting in the dark. The iron key was still clutched in his hand. He stared at it in the pale morning light. Its surface mottled with rust, it felt heavier than before, as if the house itself had poured its weight into the metal. He tried to throw it away once. He'd stood in the clearing, arm drawn back, ready to hurl it into the fog, but his hand had refused to move. His fingers wouldn't release it. He'd fallen to his knees, clutching the cursed object, and whispered through clenched teeth, "I don't want this," the house had whispered back. "You do?" The day of silence. That day, the house was too quiet. The whispers had stopped, the scratching had stopped. Even the shifting of the paintings had ceased. Samir wandered through the halls with the eerie sense that he was walking through a held breath. Every room he entered felt staged, arranged, as if waiting for him to notice something. In the study, the journal he had slammed shut was now open again. Its pages turned to a passage he hadn't read before. Once the chosen one holds the key, the silence begins. It is the waiting. It is the hunger before the feast. Samir's skin crawled. He slammed the book closed again, but the words echoed in his head long after. The hunger before the feast. The door beckons. By evening, the silence had become unbearable. It pressed on his skull, louder than any whisper. The locked door upstairs weighed on him like a magnet, pulling his thoughts again and again. He found himself pacing the upstairs hallway. The portraits along the walls seemed sharper than ever, their blurred features resolving into grotesque details. One woman's eyes followed him with unmistakable awareness, a child's painted mouth curled into a mocking grin. At the far end, the door waited. Its iron lock gleamed faintly, though no light touched it. Samir reached out, his fingers brushing the cold metal. The key in his pocket burns like ice, he whispered to himself. Not yet, but the door seemed to pulse beneath his hand, like something breathing on the other side. The figure in the clearing. That night, he dreamed thought he dreamed of. The clearing. The fog had lifted, and the moonlight poured silver across the weeds. The figure in the dark coat stood once again, closer now, his face no longer blurred. His eyes were pits of shadow, his grin split impossibly wide. In his hand, the figure held a chain. At the end of the chain dangled a lock. The same iron lock from the upstairs door. The figure raised it high and spoke in a voice that rattled Samir's bones. "Open it!" Samir woke with a start, the key clutched in his fist so tightly it had cut his palm. The basement again. Driven by a desperate need for answers, he returned to the basement. The jars still lined the shelves, their contents shifting faintly in the murky liquid. The chest still waited in the corner, journals spilling from its mouth like rotten teeth. He lit a candle, the flame trembling in his unsteady grip, and searched through the journals again. One passage made his blood run cold. She is bound by chains and symbols. As long as the door remains sealed, she cannot walk the halls. But the Chosen One hears her voice. The Chosen One is her key. Samir dropped the journal, bile rising in his throat. He was the Chosen One. The house hadn't lured him here by accident. It had picked him, and it wanted him to open the door. The candle sputtered as Samir stumbled back from the journal, the words etched into his mind like scars. The Chosen One is her key. He wanted to scream. He wanted to deny it, to hurl the book into the fire and flee into the forest. But the memory of walking in endless circles, always returning to the house, stopped him. There was no escape. The house had chosen him, the cracks in reality. As the hours dragged on, Samir began to notice things that weren't there before. Shadows moved where no light fell. Faces in the portraits sharpened until he could make out every wrinkle, every line of malice in their features. The floor creaked with footsteps, even when he stood still. Sometimes, when he blinked, the walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as though the house itself inhaled him. And once, as he walked past the mirror in the upstairs hallway, he caught his reflection smiling at him. But he hadn't been smiling. He smashed the glass with the butt of the flashlight, but the reflection lingered in the shards, still smiling. The locked door at dusk. By dusk, Samir found himself once more standing at the locked door. He didn't remember walking there. His body had moved of its own accord, as if pulled by invisible strings. The whispers returned, not faint, not subtle, but loud, crawling through his skull. Samir, open, open, open. Dust rained from the ceiling. The iron lock trembled against the wood, as though it were fighting to hold back a tide. Samir pressed his hands against his ears, shouting, "Shut up! Leave me alone." The voices laughed. 100 mouths, 1,000 echoes, all dripping with hunger. And then silence. The temptation. The key burned in his pocket like a brand. He pulled it out, staring at the rusted metal. It seemed to throb faintly, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. "If I open it," he muttered, "maybe this ends. Maybe I break the curse." But another voice inside him hissed, "Or maybe you free something that should never be freed." He pressed the key into the lock. The cold bit into his skin, sending a shock up his arm. The metal turned to isolate, like it had been waiting, but he stopped just before the final click. His breath came ragged, sweat dripping down his face. He yanked the key out and stumbled back, heart hammering. The door was quiet again, patient, waiting. The night of chains. That night, Samir didn't dare sleep. He sat in the living room, clutching the knife, the journals spread around him. At midnight, the chains rattled. The sound wasn't upstairs. It was inside the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath his feet. Heavy chains dragging, clinking, tightening. The house shook with it, groaning like a beast in pain. The portraits screamed silently, their mouths stretched wide, eyes rolling with terror. Samir fell to his knees, covering his ears. The sound grew louder, closer, until he felt cold metal brush against his skin, unseen chains coiling around his wrists and ankles. And then a voice thundered through the house, not a whisper but a roar. "You are mine." The chains vanished. Silence fell. Samir lay trembling on the floor, the knife clattering from his hand. Samir dragged himself off the floor, his body trembling as though he had been beaten. His wrists ached where the phantom chains had gripped him. Faint red marks etched into his skin. He stumbled to the couch, clutching his head. The silence that followed was suffocating. Too complete, too deliberate. It felt like the calm before something worse. The journal's final pages. He forced himself to read again. The journals were his only source of answers, however fragmented. He flipped through pages filled with frantic drawing spirals, eyes, figures with mouths gaping wide. Near the end of one journal, he found a passage that chilled him more than any whisper. "Once the chosen holds the key, the chains will weaken. The house will hunger louder. The mouth will not stay closed forever. The only choice is whether the chosen opens it or is devoured whole." Samir slammed the book shut, rage boiling in him. "So I'm just a sacrifice?" he shouted into the empty air. "That's all I am to you," the house answered with a low groan, as if amused. "The return of the figure." Desperate for air, Samir staggered to the upstairs window again. The fog outside had thinned, moonlight dripping silver across the clearing. And there he was, the man in the coat, standing closer than ever before. His hollow eyes locked on Samir's, grin stretched impossibly wide. But this time, the figure moved, step by step. He approached the house, his boots leaving no sound on the ground. He stopped at the front door, lifted his hand, and knocked. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound reverberated through the walls, through Samir's bones. And then, without opening the door, the figure vanished. When Samir turned back to the hallway, muddy footprints led from the staircase straight to the locked room. The choice looms. The house was closing in. Every corner, every shadow seemed to breathe. The whispers returned, no longer soft but insistent, demanding, "Open it! Open it! Open it!" Samir pressed his hands over his ears, tears burning his eyes. "No. No. No. I can't." But deep inside, he knew the truth. The house would never stop. The chains would never release him. The forest would never let him leave. The only path forward was through the locked door, the prelude to the mouth. That night, Samir sat before the door itself, the key in his hand, the knife on his lap, his breath fogged in the cold air, his pulse hammering in his ears. He spoke aloud, as though trying to convince himself, "If I open it, maybe I die." But if I don't, the house'll eat me alive. The lock gleamed faintly, the metal trembling as if it already knew what was coming. From the other side, the whispers quieted, replaced by something far worse: silence, thick and waiting. He pressed his forehead to the wood and whispered, "Tomorrow night, I'll open you." The wood pulsed warm against his skin, like the beat of a heart. And in the stillness of the house, a single word answered him from the other side: "Good." End of Chapter 3. Samir staggered back to his room, clutching the key. He lay awake all night, staring at the ceiling, knowing he had already made his choice. The final confrontation was coming. The door would open, and whatever waited behind it would finally be free. The key was heavier than stone in Samir's hand. He carried it with him everywhere, unable to put it down, unable to leave it behind. It was as though the iron had fused with his flesh, the weight sinking into his bones. All day, the house remained still. No whispers, no scratching, no laughter in the walls. The silence was worse than the noise had ever been. It pressed against him, suffocating, as if the house were holding its breath in anticipation. Samir knew what it was waiting for. Tonight, the door would open, preparing for the inevitable. He searched the basement again, rifling through the rotting shelves and forgotten boxers, desperate for anything that could help him survive. His hands shook as he found candles, half burned, and sticks of chalk. The journal spoke of circles, of symbols drawn in flame and blood to restrain what lived in the locked room. He didn't know if he believed them, but he had no other choice. He cleared the floor of the living room, pushed aside the broken furniture, and began to draw. The chalk crumbled under his hand as he traced the circle from the journal. Sketches on, intricate weave of spirals and jagged lines. He lit the candles at its edges, their flames flickering weakly, casting shadows that writhed along the walls. In the center, he placed the hunting knife he had found earlier, its blade gleaming faintly. It was a poor weapon, but it was all he had. The calm before. As twilight bled into night, Samir sat in the circle, staring into the darkened hallway, his breath fogged in the chill. The house remained silent, the stillness so deep that he could hear the thud of his own heartbeat. The silence broke with a single sound. Click! The lock upstairs turned on its own. Samir bolted upright, staring toward the staircase. He hadn't touched the key. It was still clenched in his fist. Yet the sound came again, metal sliding, tumblers falling. The lock was opening itself. The door opens. The entire house groaned as the door at the end of the hallway creaked slowly open. Darkness spilled down the staircase, thicker than shadow, curling like smoke. The candles in Samir's circle flickered wildly, nearly snuffed out. From the open doorway came the rattle of chains, slow, deliberate. Then the whisper, no longer faint, no longer pleading, a voice that shook the walls. "Samir, I'm free." The first step. She emerged slowly, her form shifting with each movement. At first, a woman's pale skin stretched tight across her bones, long black hair falling in wet strands across her face. Then, as she descended, her body twisted, limbs bending too far, her mouth splitting wider than any human's should. Chains clung to her wrists and ankles, dragging behind her. glowing faintly with the same symbols Samir had seen in the journals. Each step cracked the floorboards, the air growing colder, heavier. Her hollow eyes locked on him, and she smiled. End of part 1. Samir stumbled back into the circle, clutching the knife, his breath ragged. The symbols beneath him glowed faintly, resisting the darkness pressing at their edges. But the chains rattled louder, and the figure whispered, voice dripping with hunger, "The circle won't save you, Samir. You were made for me." The glow of the circle pulsed weakly under Samir's feet. He knelt in the center, clutching the hunting knife, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. The figure moved closer, chains scraping against the wooden floor with each deliberate step. The symbols flared brighter as she neared, the chalk lines igniting faintly as if resisting her presence. She hissed, her grin faltering for a moment. "So he did try to protect you?" she whispered, her voice layered, echoing as though 100 throats spoke at once. "Your uncle. Foolish man. He thought his words and his scribbles could keep me bound forever." Samir's pulse quickened. "What are you?" he demanded, though the knife trembled in his hand. She tilted her head, her hair falling away from her face. Beneath it was not flesh, but shifting shadow, writhing as though a swarm of insects lived inside her skin. "I am hunger," she said. "I am the house. I am the mouth that devours. And you," she leaned forward, her hollow eyes burning into him, "you are the key." The assault. With a shriek that rattled the windows, she lunged at the circle. Her body hit the barrier, sparks of light erupting as the chalk lines blazed red. The ground shook, dust falling from the ceiling. Samir screamed, gripping the knife tighter. The barrier held for now, but cracks formed in the glowing lines, small fissures spreading outward. The circle was weakening. The journals had warned him. Chalk alone was not enough. Blood was the binding. The price. Samir slashed the blade across his palm. The pain sharp, hot. Blood welled and dripped onto the circle. The symbols flared with sudden fire, flames racing along the lines, the barrier roaring to life. The figure screamed, recoiling, her body twisting violently, her shadow flesh sizzling under the light. For a moment, Samir dared to hope. But then, laughter erupted, not just from her, but from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The entire house shook with it. "You think you can stop me?" she roared, her voice thundering. "You're not fighting me, boy. You are feeding me." The flames dimmed. The blood hissed against the wood, seeping into the floor. Samir's vision blurred, his strength draining. He realized with horror that the circle wasn't binding her, it was binding him. The revelation! Images crashed into his mind, not his own memories but echoes of others before him. Men and women standing in the same circle, bleeding into the same symbols, whispering the same desperate words. Each one had been chosen. Each one had been devoured. The house had never been a prison. It was a trap, a lure, and Samir was simply the next link in the chain. The choice? The figure pressed against the barrier again, her grin splitting wider, teeth too many to count. The walls groaned, beams splintering, as the house itself seemed to lean closer. Samir's Strength faltered. His blood stained the wood, feeding the circle, feeding her. He clutched the knife, his vision swimming. He could let the circle consume him. Another sacrifice swallowed by the house. Or he could turn the blade on the source of the hunger. His eyes lifted to her, chains rattling, laughter shaking the room. And for the first time, Samir didn't feel fear. He felt fury. End of part 2 with a scream. He staggered to his feet, the knife dripping blood, and shouted into the darkness, "If you want me, then choke on me." The flames of the circle flared violently, the entire house shuddering as the figure lunged one final time. The circle roared to life as Samir screamed, his blood soaking the symbols until the lines glowed like molten steel. The figure shrieked, staggering backward, her shadow flesh writhing as though set ablaze. Chains rattled violently, snapping one by one. The sound like thunder rolling through the house. The portraits along the walls convulsed, faces twisting, mouths opening in silent screams. Windows shattered, shards raining inward as the storm outside surged once more. The entire house trembled, as though preparing to collapse. The struggle Samir gritted his teeth, every muscle straining to keep himself upright. His body screamed with pain, but he pressed forward, knife raised, the circle flaring brighter with each drop of his blood. "You will not take me," he roared. The figure's grin split wider, her jaw unhinging until it stretched down to her chest, rows upon rows of teeth glistening in the firelight. Her voice came from everywhere at once, walls, ceiling, floor, even from inside Samir's skull. "You already belong to me. You all do." She lunged. Samir met her with the knife. The blade plunged into her chest, cutting through shadow and flesh alike. For a moment, there was silence. Then an explosion of screams erupted, dozens, hundreds, thousands of voices shrieking as though 1,000 trapped souls had been released at once. The collapse, the floor split beneath them. Flames surged upward, devouring the walls. Beams cracked and fell, the ceiling caving in as the house groaned like a dying beast. Samir was thrown backward, crashing against the far wall. Pain shot through his ribs, but he forced himself to crawl. The front door was gone, consumed by fire. The windows were nothing but blackened holes, leading into endless fog. Behind him, the figure writhed on the floor, her body unraveling into smoke and ash. She screamed his name, the sound rattling his bones. "Samir!" The chains whipped wildly, striking the walls, carving deep scars into the wood. Symbols burned away, one by one, as though the house itself was dying with her. The escape? Samir stumbled toward the staircase, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. Each step threatened to give way beneath him, but he pushed forward. The clearing outside was visible through the collapsing roof, moonlight spilling down like salvation. He reached the second-floor hallway, where the locked door now hung open, splintered, flames licking its edges. He forced himself past it, through falling debris, until he reached a broken window. With a desperate cry, he hurled himself through the frame. Glass tore at his arms and legs as he fell, crashing into the weeds below. Pain flared, but he rolled, gasping, staring up at the inferno. The house burned, flames consuming it from the inside out. The scream of the figure rose one last time, echoing into the night, before being swallowed by the roar of the fire. The ashes. Samir lay in the clearing for what felt like hours. the heat of the fire washing over him. The forest was silent again. No whispers. No footsteps. No laughter. When the flames finally died, only a blackened skeleton of stone remained. The house was gone. He forced himself to his feet, every bone aching, and staggered toward the forest path. For the first time since arriving, the fog had lifted. A pale trail stretched ahead, clear and unobstructed. He laughed weakly, tears burning his eyes. He was free. The final twist. But as he turned one last time to look at the ruins, his breath caught. Among the ashes, untouched by flame, stood a single painting. Its canvas was clean, its frame unburned. The face on it was his own. Samir's mouth went dry. He stumbled backward, shaking his head. No, 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 that's not possible. The painted version of himself smiled, and then, faintly, from the ruins of the house, a whisper drifted on the wind. You are not alone. Thank you for journeying with us through this nightmare. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more long chilling tale. And remember, some houses don't just shelter the living, they hunger for them. Until next time, sleep well. If you can.